Great. Well, thank you very much for inviting me here. I'm really pleased to be here, and it's just great to have the chance to explore some of these topics and to discuss them with you. Got no slides today. I'm on a bit of an anti-PowerPoint kick at the moment, but it'll return, I'm sure. What I want to talk about is why politicians aren't currently bridging the gap between evidence and action, and say a bit about how we could encourage politicians to bridge that gap. Now, I mean, I'm talking about politicians because it's based on the work I've done training MPs, but some of this, you know, is much more widely applicable to business people, to communities more generally. Where I want to start is, well, my other half is a crossword fanatic. You know, proper geeky websites, the lot. And on the internet discussion forums about crosswords, they all talk about PDMs. And a PDM is the penny drop moment. And it's where you've been wrestling with a whole series of diffuse clues that don't really seem to fit together. And suddenly, something clicks, they all come together, and you see the whole grid. And you see actually what the setter intended of the crossword. And then, you know, from then on, it's plain sailing. Well, I thought that was quite a useful analogy, because what I have actually seen with the work that we've done with politicians, not always, but sometimes, is a penny drop moment on climate change. So we take 10 MPs at a time, all from the same party, so they feel comfortable. We more or less lock them in a room with a scientist, very good scientist. We lock them in a room with a scientist, and we let them ask whatever questions they want about climate change. And you can imagine what they come out with. There's a lot about how do we trust the scientists, about, you know, all the various email scandals that happened. There's the very basics of the, you know, 19th century physics about how the gas gets trapped in the first place. And then there's all the stuff about impact. And that all comes out one way or another. And in 5 out of the 6 of sessions, you can ask me about the 6th if you want, but in the 5 out of the 6 sessions, there has been a PDM. And there's been a time at which the politicians have realised that what is being discussed is a real game changer. And they start to realise that, you know, the development of modern societies has depended on a stable climate, that, you know, agriculture over the past 10,000 years has depended on a stable climate, and that their future as individuals and politicians will be shaped by the science that they see before them. And that's a really significant moment. And in fact, you actually see a change of atmosphere in the room as a result. And it's really quite striking. And I mean, just to give you an example of a precise moment, there was one, I can't remember which party it was, but there was one moment at which good old Brian Hoskins, who's the climate scientist we were using, incredibly patient, he started explaining how if you're taking, you know, if you're looking at sort of 2-3 degree rise, and you look just purely at surface temperatures, you look at the amount of the globe where daytime temperatures will start pushing into the high 30s. And then he said, well, look, the human body can't actually work at temperatures, you know, way much beyond the sort of mid-high 30s. So it's very difficult to farm. It's very difficult to have any kind of industry, you know, at that kind of, once you're reaching those kinds of areas. So even if you look at it purely from the productivity of the human body, there is a threshold. And that in that seminar, that was the moment at which people thought, oh, okay, right, this is really significant. It could in other events, it's been something about you know, the thresholds for agricultural production, or, you know, refugee issues. It's a different issue, but people realise that it's incredibly significant. I just wanted to say 4 things that I've learned through this work with MPs as a beginning for. As a beginning to explore how we take politicians and other players to that kind of penny drop moment and beyond it, to start building a proper response to climate change. And as I was cycling madly through Lancaster to this talk, I suddenly thought in terms of the university that actually these 4 points that I'm going to cover probably, in terms of discipline, they probably cover just about every discipline this university does. And I thought next time I would print out some discipline bingo cards, and and you could tick off. I mean, if anyone wants to shout full house at some point, go ahead. But it's politics, it's psychology, it's just about every one of the sciences. It's engineering. I could go on. But the first lesson for me is the good old feminist slogan that the personal is political. And I don't think we should underestimate this, that politicians are shaped by their personal circumstances, their education, the media they consume, the people they hang out with. And if people aren't talking about climate change in those sorts of spheres, then you shouldn't expect them to take it seriously. If climate change isn't part of their lived experience, then their emotional or intellectual engagement with the issue is bound to be trivial at best. So one of the things we've tried to do with politicians is hold sessions for them in their constituency, talk to them about the green economy in their area, or talk to them about flood risk in their area, and bring together people whose opinions they care about, who can say something about climate change impacts or mitigation. So take it down to the personal. The second point is, and as far as politics is concerned, it is just worth remembering that both our political traditions on the left and on the right have grown up essentially in times of relative resource abundance. And both the left and the right have pretty much been able to assume a benign, stable environment in which to do politics. I mean environment in terms of natural environment in which to do politics. And so you find two political traditions which are quite either hostile about or dismissive of the environmental message. So on the left, you find that people are talking about fairness, equity, and they see the environment as almost a luxury, as something to do when you've got those big moral questions sorted. You might want to do the environment, but it's almost like the environment is a rich person's concern. And you see that time and time again on the left. On the right, it's much more about the philosophy of small government and letting the market work, and they don't quite they can't quite deal with an issue which essentially there's no getting away from it. It requires a long-term collectivist response, which is very different from a short-term market-led response, and they don't quite know where to go with that. So another thing that we've been trying to do through this project and other work that Green Alliance has done is actually get back to some of those fundamental political discussions about what is the project of the centre-left, what is a right-wing response to climate change, and try and work out how you would incorporate in a sense what the founding fathers of these political movements would have, how they would have approached climate change if it had been a significant issue 200 years ago. And a third and related point is that up until now, to the extent to which politicians have taken environmental issues on board, it's very much it's been very much that approach of trying to protect the environment or preserve nature. So in other words, it's asking what we can do for the environment. So we'll look after the people first, and then we'll look after the environment. But the interesting thing about climate change and some of the resulting environmental problems around water scarcity and resource use is that it turns that on its head. So we can't anymore assume a reasonably benign natural environment in which to operate. And we can't treat the natural environment as essentially a backdrop to politics or something separate from it. we have to acknowledge that maintaining a stable climate must be a job for politics itself, that should be what politics is about. And so it's, ask not what we can do for the environment, but what the environment can do for us, has been doing for us, and won't do for us much longer unless we tackle some of these issues. And I think one of the problems around this politicians' connection with the natural world is just that actually politics is an urban thing, isn't it? It's they're all desk jockeys, as probably are most people in this room, and they're creatures of the cultural world and not the natural world. And the more that we can do to reintegrate people with the natural environment, I don't think that's trivial. I think that's really significant. And Kate Rawls is here, who takes people sea kayaking and talks to them about the natural environment on a sea kayak, in a sea kayak. Yeah, you should go if you haven't. It's brilliant. But I would love to do my future climate training sessions in a sea kayak, or at least up a fell. And I do think that changes people's outlooks. And lastly, point 4, there's this perpetual discussion that goes back and forward, the question of whether politicians should lead or follow. Environment is not perceived to be a central political concern. It's definitely not a central electoral concern. And so politicians are wary of championing an issue that doesn't get that support from the electorate or from their communities. But this relationship between a politician and the electorate is actually much more complex than it would appear. They don't actually, follow the lead of the electorate. There's a lot of, on a lot of issues, politicians are willing to make the case. So the question here is, how do you create that political space for this discussion? How do you work with politicians to create the conditions within which you can have a dialogue with people about the cultural shifts that are needed, the environmental shifts that are needed? So rather than kind of coming up with this sterile debate about are we leading or following, I think we should be talking about how we create that political space. And so those are the kind of 4 main lessons I think I've taken from doing this work with politicians. And the last thing I'd say, and maybe a springboard to discussion later, is that I want to challenge all of you and myself, obviously, to get beyond the "if I ruled the world" syndrome. And what you see in my field a lot is people coming out with absolutely amazing blueprints for a zero carbon Britain, for renewables to head up there. And you can, if it was a game of Risk and you were in charge of everything and you could push the pieces around the board, we could easily get to a decent place on this. We could achieve what we need to do. But it's actually not about defining your perfect endpoint. Politics is about the messy business of defining your vision and then getting there. And so I think it's too easy to blame the politicians on this. They will struggle with this. Some of them are trying really hard and struggling on it. Others don't care. But these radical policies that we talk about, this zero carbon Britain that we talk about, the ambitious climate deal that we talk about, they all require political leadership. And the politicians need a hell of a lot of support to manage that incredibly complex transition. So what we need to do, I think, with politicians and, in fact, with society at large, is obviously to get them to that penny drop moment where they realise the significance of climate change and resulting environmental issues. But then also, once the penny has dropped, to be supportive and creative about how we work with them and how we push things in the right direction and how we do the art of the possible, rather than sort of defining our perfect endpoint and then being cross because people don't share our views. That's it.